Hi everyone, welcome to Math Tutorials 82, where we master together the skills that will set you up for success. So today we'll be talking about the basic trigonometric functions. So which ones are these? These would be your sine, cosine, and tangent. We discussed in a previous video how to obtain these functions using triangles. I will link that video in the description. So, why is it important to know these functions? Well, other than triangles, these functions are found in our everyday lives, such as the voltage and current that we use on a daily basis. So, for any AC voltage or current, a sine function, a sine or cosine function can be used to identify these elements. So for instance, the AC voltage in Europe has an amplitude of 220 volts and a frequency of 60 hertz. Meanwhile, the AC voltage in the US has an amplitude of 120 volts and a frequency of 60 hertz. And for Europe, it's actually 50 hertz. So, what does this mean? This means that we are interfacing with these trigonometric functions directly and indirectly with everything we do. So, that's why it's important to know them a little bit more in detail. So, other than triangles, we can also obtain these functions through the use of circles. And you may be asking yourself, how is this possible? So, there are two ways that these functions can be found or can be characterized using circles. So, a circle is a non-ending line if you look at it the right way. And what do you mean by that? Well, simple. A circle starts at 0 degrees and can be cut up into infinite lines or infinite degrees. So, in our case, when you go around the circle, this has up to 360 degrees in just one circle. But you'll see how this gets even more interesting as we go ahead. So in degrees, if we were to cut this circle into 8 smaller chunks, and each chunk would be 45 degrees, we could characterize it as 45, 90, 135, 180, which would be half the circle, 225, 270, 315, or 360. So this would be in degrees, but how will we do the same thing in radians? So it would be as such. So a circle can be either placed in degrees or radians, and as we know, pi is equal to 22 over 7. This was discussed in a previous video, and I will link it in the description of this video. So going back to the circle, so since a circle has the same beginning and ending, And if we were to cut the circle into 8 similar chunks, instead of 45 degrees, we could characterize it as p fourths. So p fourths, p halves, 3p fourths, p, 5p fourths, 3p halves, 7p fourths, and 2 pi. But as you know, pi is a constant, so it can be a number. So that's why I mentioned degrees are in angles, radians are actual numbers. So, and something interesting about a circle is that since it's never ending, what happens if we go beyond 2 pi? So if we have a function that needs, number, because as we know, numbers can go infinitely up. So 6.283 isn't as high as you can go. It can go up to infinity. And so in that case, we just keep on going. So if this were greater than 2 pi, we would continue on in the circle. So for instance, if it were 4 pi, we would go around the circle twice. So that way we get this equation where depending on the number that we have, so we have this 6.28 and we multiply that by n as many times that we need to go. So if we were to go to infinity, we would multiply this 6.283 times n, which would also be infinity, so it would give us infinity. So we know that 2 pi is equal to 6.283, and if n goes to infinity, then we would have to multiply 6.283 times infinity, which gives us infinity. So, if you've enjoyed the video thus far, you get 1 gold star. So, how do we know if whatever we're using is in degrees or in radians? So we just have to test it out and make sure that we have our laptop, our software, our calculator set up in the right coordinate system. So in this case, I'm going to use Excel as an example. So here we have the two functions of cosine, both in degrees and in radians, calculated using the cosine function of Excel. So this goes from 0, just like our circle, it's cut up into 8 chunks of each one of 45 degrees apart. And so when we use the cosine function on degrees, we get this curve right here in blue. And when we use the cosine function in radians, we get this orange function here. So a good rule of thumb is that we know that cosine is 1 for 0 degrees, but the giveaway comes by 90 degrees or pi halves. Cosine is 0. So in this case, because we have a negative number for our 90-degree angle, or for our cosine degrees, we know that that's not the correct units to use. So in this case, Excel uses radians. So we can forget using degrees in Excel. But you may be asking yourselves, what happens as we, add or remove degrees from cosine, as we showed in the circle, because it goes on forever. So let's add 10 degrees to see what happens. As you can see, the chart starts to change a little bit. And our function is actually, it looks like it's moving if we go fast enough. And if we add 180 degrees, it flips. So this is one of the interesting things about cosine, since it goes infinitely positive or infinitely negative, depends on your preference. The function is never ending, which is also the same case for sine. So what happens with sine and with cosine? So here in orange is here in blue is our cosine, and here in orange is our sine. So how far apart is sine from cosine? Well, let's see what happens. So if we add 10 degrees, looks like it's getting closer. 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90. So in other words, cosine is 90 degrees ahead of sine, or sine is 90 degrees behind cosine. Depends on however you want to state it, but they're both 90 degrees apart. So cosine and sine are very well related one to the other. And so you might be asking to yourself, how does that affect tangent? Well, tangent isn't quite an obvious chart because it's sine over cosine. And so in this case, when sine is 0, so let's look at the chart above. Let's make this a little bit smaller so that we have a good idea what's going on. So when sine is 0, well, tangent is 0. When sine is 1 and cosine is 0, this goes towards infinity. However, when sine is 0 and these three portions, tangent is going to be 0, as seen here in this chart. The other part is when cosine is 1 and sine is 0, well, 0. But when sine is negative 1 and cosine is 0, that's where we also have where this can go to infinity as well. So I hope this has been very eye-opening, and you've been able to gain more insight on basic trigonometric functions and how they're found in our everyday lives. And I hope you liked the video, and see you in the next one.